Hey guys, Miss Smith here. I am going to go through section one through, or sorry, 3.1 with you guys. And this is probably something that you saw before in geometry and maybe a little bit in algebra one, but it's called direct variation. And this is the beginning of our linear unit. So I think we'll be covering the first three sections of unit three prior to winter break. So this is the first one. And you guys probably remember it. I don't know if you remember the idea of setting up proportions and using cross multiplication to solve them. But that's really the basic part or idea of this unit. So it says here we say two variables are directly related or proportional to one another if this relationship holds. So it says two variables, x and y, have a direct or proportional relationship if for every ordered pair we have um, stated succinctly, I can't say that, y will always be a constant multiple of x. So the value of k is known as the constant of variation. That probably seems like a lot of words and information and kind of a foreign language, but I'm going to try to break down so you just can see the basics and hopefully help this make a little bit of sense to you. So um, here we go with direct variation. We set up proportions and use cross multiplication to solve them. So this is the topic, the direct variation. How we're going to approach it is one, we'll set up a proportion, and then two, use cross multiplication to solve. So if we kind of go back to a proportion situation, I'm just going to use letters for now. Let's say we say that we have A over B is equal to C over D. So all a proportion is an equation that compares two ratios, and a ratio is just a fraction. So this fraction is comparing A to B, and this fraction is comparing C to D. So this is a proportion, what it looks like from the past, and then to solve, I don't know if you guys remember doing this, or we circle the diagonals, that's cross multiplication. So to solve, we would say that A times D is equal to B times C. And then obviously out of these four variables, we'll usually have three of them that we know the values of. And so we're finding the missing piece. So that's kind of the basics of what we're going to be doing. Let's go through it with some actual examples, and I think that'll help you guys remember some of this. So in exercise one, it says in each of the following, X and Y are directly related. So as soon as we know they're directly related, this tells us to set up a proportion. Okay, so we have that, and it says solve for the missing values. So the key with setting up a proportion is just being consistent. So for example, in A, it says y equals 15 when x equals 5. So this is one of our ratios. So I always do it based off of what they say first. So if they say y first and then x, I always kind of draw like my map of what I'm going to put on top and what I'm going to put on the bottom of my proportion, of my fractions. And then I have this situation. So when they say y is 15, y goes on the top. When x is 5, so that means 5 goes with 15. So that's one of your fractions. And then they're saying, what is y? So question mark. So we don't know what y is. So I'm just going to put the variable in when x is 9. So x again goes in the bottom. Once we have that set up, then we have three values and we're finding the fourth, the missing value. So we cross multiply. So we get 5 times y equals 15 times 9. And I should be able to do that off the top of my head. 15 times 9, I think, is 135, but let me double check. Sorry, this is real life. Okay, yeah. So 5y equals 135. So that by cross multiplying, we're allowed to have an equation that doesn't have fractions in it, and it makes it a little bit easier for us to solve it. So once we get this, it's a one-step equation. We want to get y by itself. So the opposite or inverse of multiplying by 5 is to divide by 5. And so we get y equals 135 divided by 5 is 27. So that is your answer. Okay, so that's one example. In these other two, it is the same process. And in all of these give you y and then x. So kind of our map or how our setup is going to be is that way. So I always, again, kind of draw that map for myself so I know what I'm going to put on the top and what I'm going to put on the bottom. And then I know these are paired together. So when y is -6, x is 4. I don't know y, and x is -10. So again, once I set up that proportion, that's my first step. Then I cross multiply. Be careful with your negatives here. So we get 4y equals -10, -6 times -10 is +60. Then again, divide by 4 to get y by itself, and y is 15. Okay, and then let's do the last example, and then we'll look at how we can apply this to some word problem scenarios. So same thing, y is 12 when x is 16. So we're going to put y on the top, x on the bottom. I again kind of set up my blank proportion so I can just fill in numbers. So y is 12 when x is 16. We want to know what y is when x is 24. So these are a little bit bigger numbers. I can't even do this math in my head. So when I cross multiply, I get 16y equals, if I write it out, 12 times 24. And again, if I use my phone, 12 times 24 is 288. And then if I divide by 16 on both sides, we get 18. Okay, so that's the most basic way to deal with direct variation, is being given some relationships of comparing two things. And in this case, we're just comparing what x and y are, and then using that to set up proportion. So two fractions or ratios that are equal to each other. There'll always be one missing piece, and we cross multiply to find that missing part. The word problems with this, well, I know you guys typically don't like word problems that often. They aren't really that bad because we really just try to do the same thing. So if we look at this example 2, it says the distance a person can travel. So the key here is that knowing what two things are varying. So the distance a person can travel. So I'm just going to call that D. Varies directly. So here's kind of our key piece, which says we set up a proportion with the time they've been traveling. So I'm going to call the time T. And again, like I said, I always kind of set up my map. So D was listed first. So I'm going to put that on the top of the fraction, and it varies directly as the time T. So I'm going to put that on the bottom of the fraction. So this is kind of my map on how I'm going to set up my proportion. And then all word problems are now going to give you two more statements. They're going to give you a sentence that gives you two pieces of information, two numbers, and that will form your first fraction or ratio. And then they'll give you a second sentence where there's a question and they ask what one of these are and they give you the other one. So for example, it says if Phoenix traveled 78 miles in 1.5 hours. So that's like if y is this and x is this. So they gave us D, the distance. So that goes on top. And then they gave us the time that happened in. So 1.5 hours. And then it says, how far will he travel in 2 hours? Okay, so how far will he travel in 2 hours? Well, the question how far is asking the question of distance. So that's what we don't know, but they give us the time that they want to know it in. So 2 hours goes down here. Once we have 3 of the numbers out of the 4 filled in, we cross multiply, just like we did before. So we get 1.5D equals 78. Oops. 78 times 2, I think, should be 156. Let me just double check that. 78 times 2 is 156, and then we'll divide both sides by 1.5, just like we did on the other sheet. So the distance that Phoenix travels in 2 hours, we divide this by 1.5, is 104. And here's the difference with word problems. They have a context to them. So when we answer them, we can't just leave a number. We have to say what this is. Well, if it's representing distance, our distance was given in miles. So our answer is miles. So we would say Phoenix travels 104 miles in 2 hours. So that's an example of one word problem. Another one, we'll do one more here down here together. So this one says Jenna works a job where her pay, so I'm going to call that P, varies directly. So this means we set up a proportion with the number of hours she works. So I'm going to call that H. So her pay depends on hours. Okay, so in the first thing it says in 1 week, she worked 35 hours. So here's the numbers we need, 35 hours, and made $274.75. So since I saw the pay first, that said pay varies directly as hours. This is going to be my setup. So I always kind of put that map there for me to follow. And then I know I'm going to have to fill in a proportion. Well, this is the first part of the proportion. So 35 hours, so hours goes in the bottom. And the amount of money that she got paid was $274.75. Okay, and then the next thing says how many hours would she need to work to earn $337.55. So if we want to know the amount of hours, they're not giving it to us, so that's the unknown. Sorry, this cuts it off here. But they tell us that she wants to make $337.55. Now, some of you guys are thinking, Ms. Smith or Mr. Bechtel or Ms. Pugh or whoever's teaching this, can you put the hours on top and the pay on the bottom? Yes, but whatever you do, you have to be consistent. So if you put the hours on the top, both hours have to go on top, and then both the pays have to go on the bottom. So as long as you're consistent, that's the key. Then we cross multiply. Again, these are not nice numbers, so we're going to use the trusty calculator. So we get 35 times 337. So 35 times 337.55. So 35 hours times that is 11,814.25 cents. And then we have 274.75 times H. So again, our variable now is on the right side, so we still divide by that number that's by the variable. We do that on both sides. Oops, this is 74.75. So if we take $11,814.25 and divide by 274.75, we find out that H, which is the hours, is 43 hours. So basically what they're saying, if Jenna works 35 hours, she's going to make this much money. They want to know how many hours she has to make this much money. And this would be how much. So it's 8 more hours than she worked here. So you would say Jenna must work 43 hours to make $337.55. Okay, so that's kind of what direct variation is in the most basic way without a word context to it, just with X's and Y's, and then also with a word problem context to it. So as far as homework for this, you guys will just be practicing those two different types of problems. And then if you have questions, you can ask your teacher when you guys talk about this in class. All right.